How's everyone doing today? Welcome to my channel. Thanks for tuning in today. We're an educational channel that tries to delve into important theories and discoveries that you probably never heard of before. And we are examining, doing Bible decodes. I think this is number 240. And we've been sticking with the New Testament and exploring the ins and outs of the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. That is, that the New Testament was written by the Romans, by the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty of Caesars. Sorry, I lost something there. The Flavian dynasty of Caesars from 69 until 96 AD. Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian. And they wrote the Gospels as a psychological operation, a psyop, against the Jews. They had just gotten done fighting the Jews in a war from 66 to 73 AD. Both Vespasian and Titus were the general military commanders for the Romans, and they were both wounded in the war, and they were both quite tired of dealing with the militants of the Jews who had been a thorn in the side of the Romans for the last century and a quarter since the Romans pulled into Judea in 63 BC. The Jews were separatist people, the chosen people, and they didn't take kindly to, colonial rule in general. Especially, the Romans were quite tolerant of other people's religions, but they felt like you had to give a nod to Caesar at the same time. And so when Emperor Caligula attempted to put a bust of his a statue of him in the temple of Jerusalem, that nearly ended up in a war. The Jews were not having it, and the Jews were willing to die over that. And there were many other rituals that the Jews were compelled to do according to their God, and they were willing to die for those too. And so Vespasian and Titus and many other Romans wanted to really tame the Jews, to domesticate the Jews, to kind of prune them, cut them back so that they obeyed. And the Romans knew the Jews were waiting on a Messiah. The Messiah that the Jews were waiting on was the military leader that was going to lead them against the Romans, to overthrow the Romans. And so Vespasian and Titus decided to write about a Jewish Messiah who instead was a Prince of Peace and believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's and walking the extra mile with the Roman soldiers' heavy pack and turning the other cheek to oppression, loving his enemies, believing that the Roman centurion slaveholder had the greatest faith in all of Israel, and asking his God to forgive the Romans, for they know not what they do. And so at the same time that Jesus is overturning the tables of the money changers who are Jews in the Jewish temple and excoriating the Jews who were selling small animals for the sacrifice. So, this Jewish Messiah is totally deferential to the Romans, and he is very hard on the Jews. We'll just say that. And then when you go further into the New Testament, into the Pauline epistles, you find that Paul is even more pro-Roman than Jesus was, and even more anti-Jew than Jesus was. So that was really the motive. The Romans, this was right down the alleyway of their bailiwick of their MO. They created a number of other religions in the first century for psychological purposes. And they also had the means and the opportunity, and they were really the only people who had the means and the opportunity to put the Gospels out there, because they had a monopoly on censorship, on publishing, and on distribution, meaning that no one was writing squat writing and publishing and disseminating squat in the Roman Empire, except unless it was, approved of by the Caesars. The Gospels are written in Greek, one of the two languages of the Romans, and not so much in Judea. There were people who spoke Greek, but mostly everyone was speaking Aramaic, and only the elites, top elites, were communicating in Greek and not writing it very much either. The illiteracy was much, much higher in Judea. And that is kind of where the circumstantial evidence takes us. But then when we get to the direct evidence of actually looking at the Gospels, we need a key to understand the code. And that key is the other book that the Romans were writing at this very time in the 70s AD. And that book is a history of the war between the Romans and the Jews, called War of the Jews, or Jewish War. And they wrote that under the name of Josephus, or Josephus. Now, I don't know if Josephus ever existed, but according to his autobiography, he was an agent of the Romans. According to his name, he was actually a family member of the Flavians. He's known as Flavius Josephus because he was a he was a Jewish military commander who surrendered to Vespasian in this war. And when he surrendered to Vespasian, he had an epiphany that God now favors the Romans and not the Jews. And so he defected to the Romans. And he predicted that one day Vespasian would become emperor. And when Vespasian, in fact, did become emperor in 69 AD, then turning the military over to his son Titus, he pardoned Josephus, brought him to Rome, made him one of the court historians, put him up in a townhouse at Caesar's palace, and adopted him as a member of his family. And so that whole story should really shed some light on Josephus's existence, especially when you see the identical story being peddled in other circumstances. It's called the star prophecy, where a Jew gives a prophecy that one day someone will become a ruler, but it's intended to be used on other Jews, not on Gentiles, like Josephus just does there. But his counterpart, Johanan ben Zakkai, who was really one of the founders of, the founder of the kind of campus at Jaffne, where the rabbinic Judaism tradition started. He also had the same circumstances with either Vespasian or Titus when he surrendered, and then he predicted that one day they would become the emperor. Herod the king, the original Herod, in about, I guess probably about 75 years before this, I think Herod died in 4 BC, so I think it was like in 6 BC or something, that Menahem, who apparently was an Essene, if you believe in the Essenes, but kind of a Jewish, pious Jew, possibly living at Qumran, which is where the Dead Sea Scrolls originated, but more likely a what you call Hellenized Jew, a westernized Jew, gave the same prophecy to Herod. And as a result, Herod always had a soft spot for the Essenes. So there's a tradition of that leads you to believe that this didn't really happen. And I don't know whether Josephus existed. I personally believe that Josephus was like a team of people and possibly in a family, the Peso or Piso family. They're the kind of the son of the family was named Arius Piso. And I believe he did a lot of the writing under the name of Josephus. Regardless, when you read Josephus at the same time that you're reading the Gospels, looking for parallels, the parallels will literally jump off the page. There are so many of them that it's, it goes way beyond any type of opportunity for coincidence. The intention is sometimes dripping off the parallels, along with the hatred for Jews that the Romans put into this code. Michael Menescotz looked into the book of Luke, looking for parallels. He came out finding over 250 of them just in the book of Luke. And he graphed them on a chart, putting a dot at every location where there was a parallel. Book of Luke on the vertical axis, War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. He formed 5 almost perfect letters of the same size in Latin. APTVS, Latin being the other language of the Roman Caesars, who were mostly bilingual. And Joseph Atwill has also noticed many, many, many categories and families of parallels in the 2 books, particularly the ministry of Jesus being nothing but a replica of the military campaign of Titus in Judea. Every place that Titus goes, Jesus also goes, in the same order. And they experience parallel events at each location that are spaced out by 40 years. Because, with the Gospels, the Flavians wrote the Gospels in the 70s, and they backdated the story to the early 30s, late 20s, early 30s AD. And so the events of Titus's military campaign are 40 years later than the events of Jesus's ministry. This also enables Jesus to make a lot of prophecies in the New Testament that miraculously come true in War of the Jews, which, you can say that is because Jesus was a great prophet. But unfortunately, the major prediction that Jesus makes is the destruction of Jerusalem, and that the destruction of Jerusalem, which will happen during the lifetime of some of the witnesses to my speech, the destruction of Jerusalem is the sign of my second coming. And so therefore, when General Titus destroys Jerusalem stone by stone, or however they say it, that means that he, Titus, is the second coming of Jesus. So they kind of put you in a trap there with the prophecies. And up until the 20th century, this was really the majority position among Christians, is that, you know, Titus was the second coming of Jesus, that Titus, you know, fulfilled the prophecies of Jesus. Okay, now, with that background, we're looking at a book here that goes into the Roman origins hypothesis, but doesn't come all the way out. They recognize the blatant pro-Roman orientation of Paul, but they do not recognize that in Jesus. And so they confine their investigation to Paul, and they hypothesize that Paul was an intelligent agent of the Romans. He was a spy for the Romans who had his conversion experience on the road to Damascus was a fake, and it was intended so that he could infiltrate some of the early Christian movements, particularly the Nazarenes of James, the brother of Jesus, and Peter. We're, I think, in chapter 8, and so we will take over right here. Who was Paul investigating? We do not know the specific number of Christians in Rome at this time, or what their political views were. According to the Roman historian Suetonius, who, is not to be trusted whatsoever, he was also in on it with this psychological operation. All of the early Romans, all of the people who corroborated the existence of Jesus are Roman royals. Suetonius may have actually been one of the emperors, the emperor Antoninus Pius, from like 137 to 161 AD. So this is 2nd century stuff. But Suetonius wrote a book called The 12 Caesars, and he goes into all the various Caesars. So, but if you read that, you know that you can't believe it. There's a ton of stuff in there that's very, legendary, like, nursery rhymish. Same with Josephus, same with Tacitus, same with Pliny the Younger, same with Emperor Trajan. They're all these people corroborated the existence of Jesus, but they're all in on the psyop of coming from the Roman royals, because they're all Roman royals. So he can't be taken seriously as a source. And that's a major problem, because these sources are really all we have to go by, especially Josephus. And so this requires a major overhaul of ancient history as well as religion. And not only just Christianity, but also Satanism is in the crosshairs here, because Satanism comes out of the New Testament. The Satanism that's in the Old Testament is the word Satan is used like 5 times, but each time it's depicting another human and somebody who's an obstacle or an adversary. Satan doesn't acquire like supernatural proportions until the New Testament, which is fake. And so Satan is also fake. And this also takes down a little bit of Judaism. They wrote some of the Old Testament as well, through the Septuagint and other ways, just through some of the work over there at Japhne, forcing the Jews to write their scriptures, to edit their scriptures, certain verses in, maybe like with predictions or prophecies of Jesus and so on. Okay, so according to the Roman historian Suetonius, 10 years earlier, Rome had seen riots in the name of a certain instigator called Chrestus. As a punishment for these riots, the Emperor Claudius had banned all Jews from Rome. Among scholars, there is a general consensus that the name Chrestus refers to Jesus. Judging by the banning of Jews from Rome following those riots in the name of Chrestus, it seems that it was mainly Jews who were perceived to have been involved in these riots. Right. Now, if you look at Candida Moss's work on the myth of persecution, Christians claim to have been persecuted by the Romans quite a bit, but I would definitely argue that it was Jews that were being persecuted. And some of the Jews may have had be placed in a camp that there is a permeable membrane between the Jews and the Christians at this point. If you believe the history, if you think the whole thing is just a psyop, then you don't have to worry about this. But there were many Jews who believed in Jesus, but they may have only believed in Jesus as a hero or a role model or something like that, but they stuck to their Jewish traditions. And then there were some followers of Jesus who dropped those traditions, like under Paul. Those would be Christians. The other ones were like the Nazarenes. They still held on to the traditions, the circumcisions and the kosher food and so on. And so those were the ones who were getting fed to the lions by the Romans. They wouldn't be persecuting anybody. They would be encouraging Christianity, and that's what they actually have done, culminating in the Roman Catholic Church. This then would hint at two possibilities. Firstly, that not all Christians or followers of Chrestus in Rome were altogether peaceful, an assumption which seems to be confirmed by Paul's admonition in Romans 13:1 to obey the authorities, an admonition being a clue that his audience was not obedient at the time. And secondly, that the followers of this Chrestus in Rome were originally Jews, since Claudius's response to their rioting was to ban Jews from Rome. This is all made up. This whole Chrestus thing is discussed by only these Roman royals, again, Josephus and Suetonius, and possibly Tacitus has something about Chrestus as well. Now, I'm sure that Claudius probably banned Jews from Rome, but there maybe was a different reason. By the time Paul was sent to Rome, these Jews had been allowed to return to the imperial capital. If the members of the Chrestus movement in Rome had been largely Jewish and potentially rebellious, it seems likely that the government would want to keep a finger on the pulse of the Jewish community in Rome. For this purpose, they would either need to find an informer or have one of their agents infiltrate or provoke the Jewish community. In order to find potential Jewish troublemakers, the Romans would have needed a Jew or someone who could pass for one. If Paul was a Jewish agent working for the Roman authorities in Palestine and the rest of the empire actively provoking dissidents, he would have been a good candidate for this role in Rome as well. After all, the chances are that he was a relative stranger to most Jews and or followers of Christus in Rome. At least we can safely assume that most people in Rome did not know what Paul looked like. He may have been to Rome before, but apart from the information that young men from Tarsus would often go to Rome to receive their education, and a possible clue in Paul's letter Romans, in which he sends his regards to several people in Rome, there is no evidence of his ever having been to Rome before. What Paul's information to the Romans might have done is focus the attention of the Roman police and magistrates onto the Christian community, which culminated in the persecution of 64 AD. Which, again, I don't know, they're not consistent, but the persecution of 64 AD was of Jews. Until the persecution, which followed the Great Fire of 64, whatever legal difficulties the Christian community at Rome had with the vested authorities did not spring from the fact that its members professed to believing that Christ was the Messiah. Now, I think this 64 AD, there was a fire, and Nero, who was the emperor, might have set the fire himself, and according to Tacitus, another one of the Roman royals, Tacitus says that he began to crack down on the Christians then as a result. Maybe the whole thing didn't even happen. I mean, I'm sure that the fire probably happened, but the persecution, Nero seems to get a lot of, he doesn't get a lot of mercy from the contemporaries, meaning that he could have very well been a good guy. And all of the other Roman royals were didn't like him because he had a little bit of mercy on, the hoi polloi, including the Jews. So I question whether he cracked down at either the Christians or the Jews, really, in this instance. They considered Jesus' disciples to be part of organized Judaism. Roman Christians shared in all the legal advantages and protection afforded to Judaism, and they were exempted from the obligation to sacrifice to the emperor. Yet the Neronian persecution became directed exclusively at the Christians of Rome and no other group. What could Paul have told them about these messianists that convinced them that the group was a threat? Was he spying on other Christians? And again, this is an assumption that they're making because they're believing in the story that Tacitus is telling them about this happening. And I believe that's the only source that they would have. I'll have to check out the footnote when we get there. Something he was told caused Nero to believe that the community Paul had addressed and been partially rejected by was a threat to Rome. Tacitus notes that the Christians were condemned, not for torching the city, but on charges of superstitio and their antisocial tendencies, for their abandonment of their political and religious duties, and their willful separation from the rest of society. In short, after Paul's arrival in Rome, the Christian messianists went from being an unknown, innocuous group of no social and political importance, whatever, to being a group of interest to the Roman government. Scapegoats for a fire that burned down a great part of the capital city, and an object of persecution. This would imply Roman intelligence had a plant within the group and had much better intelligence about their activities than before. Once they understood what was going on, they decided to take decisive action and eliminate the threat. Yeah, I'm going to have to think about that. I haven't read Tacitus's Annals, which is, I believe, the source that this is coming from. And I have to take a look at that to kind of figure out what... I've read a little bit of it, but I haven't read that part that's coming from Tacitus Annals 15. Because he characterizes the Christians as being antisocial and that I don't know where that would really fit in with the psychological operation. Anyway, Tacitus is writing in a much later period, early 110s, 110s AD, and so the entire psyop may have shifted by that time. This is under Emperor Trajan, and he was not one of the Flavians. The Flavian dynasty ended in 96. The Pauline epistles, according to the theory, came out afterward as well. And so, Paul's epistles were, according to the theory, written by Pliny the Younger mainly, and some of the Piso family. And so they had a little bit of a different angle on things than maybe the Flavians did. That's why it's interesting to look at the APTVS diagram that Menescot's found when he charted the parallels in the book of Luke, because the A and the P appear to have been kind of inserted later. Like the TVS, which would be Titus Vespasianus or Titus Vespasian something else. Like the Romans were signing their name to the book of Luke. But the book of Luke may have been edited again, putting the A and the P in there. And the A and the P are not nearly as well developed as the T, the V, and the S. They're kind of like more slapped together, whereas the T and the V and the S are put together with much more care and intention. So it's interesting. We'll follow up on those things. The next